like to call this meeting of the Bellingham City Council Public Works Public Safety Committee to order. Joining me on the committee this morning is Michael Lilliquist, and Roxanne Murphy is not yet here. There's Roxanne. All right. We have, what do we have here? 5 items on the agenda this morning, so we'll have to get right into them. The first is a discussion of a transportation network companies.
Good morning, Brian Heinrich, Mayor's Office. You'll remember we discussed this briefly about bringing back this item. I believe it was in March, and hopefully you had an opportunity to read the memo in the packet. Just talking to Matt, and one of the goals I think that we had talked about is you'll see this in the first 2 points, is aligning our code. It's really sort of a code update. We believe that these types of companies could operate today under our existing code, but there is value in updating our code for better clarity. And we identified a couple of goals, or actually 3. You'll see that at the top of the second page of the memo. Framework of public safety, equity among the providers, and administrative efficiency. Those are sort of our 3 goals as we look at how we might update our code. There's also 3 other areas. You'll see potential code changes. The definition, we'd like to specifically bring the idea of a transportation network company into our existing code. So there's an insurance component. There's some recent activity in the state legislature. We saw value in aligning our code with that effort. And then the vehicle inspection and the background inspection, we are looking for some specific direction from you on how we might move forward, particularly on the background inspection piece. And I wondered if, Matt, you had anything you wanted to offer to that?
No, I can answer questions if anyone has any about some of the legal aspects of this.
Okay. Committee, Michael?
I want to say, first of all, I appreciate the approach, which I see as not trying to reinvent the wheel, adopting definitions used other places, adopting the Washington State's recent insurance requirements and language as our own. I think that's really good. With regard to the background checks, I think it might be a good idea to write it so that we have the option of using third-party background checkers if we approve them. And if we don't find any we want to approve, we don't have to. So in the ordinance, we give ourselves flexibility. I don't know if we'll find a good third-party background check agency, but if we write into the ordinance, we can exercise that option if we find one.
Yes, Roxanne.
Well, my thoughts on this is that we should leave this up to the organization. Let this single organizations apply for a business permit, and then let the vehicle inspections and the background checks be managed through that organization. And then within our ordinance, we could create stipulations to make sure that that's happening. But let the organization do that to relieve us of some of the stress and the financial burden, since I believe that's the work that some of them already do.
So in that, just for some clarity, is that
2 different opinions.
in that idea, would that be, would we be looking to give maybe a set of criteria and just ask the provider and then its contractor, I guess, meet that criteria? Is that sort of the direction?
Absolutely. That's the thing I'd love. I believe there's something like 19-point criteria that vehicles are evaluated for, and I'd love for us to look at that and see if that's what would be suitable for our city. And then we can do enforcement checks every once in a while, especially if we get reports that the vehicles aren't safe, and then hopefully manage it that way.
Okay, thank you.
Couple questions on the background checks. On Michael's issue, are there outside groups that can do the background checks other than, and how is?
Some of the Matt Stamps, the city attorney's office, some of the existing companies like Uber in particular, there's a lot of information online about how they do those background checks. And I would need to look into it in more detail, but there are private companies out there, and they utilize one of those companies. I believe it's called HireEase is the name of that company. And then I think they do that in combination with doing their own direct check of some court records and things like that.
And from the memo, just to that point, we do talk about that one example is how Seattle manages it. They allow there's a city-approved third-party vendor, or they can conduct it. And I believe we currently conduct them ourselves. Is that?
That's correct. The
So
BPD
we
does
can do
the
that as well.
background check, yeah.
And within the city, who would do the approval of a third-party vendor?
I think we had talked about BPD being the approving process. That kind of makes sense. They already
Yes.
do that in some capacity today, so we think that they could perform that function moving forward as well.
Okay. Michael?
Just to clarify, we're talking about two different kinds of checks. There's a check on the driver, and then there's a check on the car. I think we're mostly talking about the check on the driver, the background check on
That's correct.
the driver. You know, I can't remember where it was, but Uber did have a problem with failed background checks. I don't even think it was in the United States. It might have been someplace like India. So, I mean, background checks on drivers is really, really important. Whether we have an improved checklist of third-party vendors, or as Roxanne is suggesting, just simply have strict criteria that those third-party vendors need to meet, it's really important that we have that piece in there.
Yeah, I agree. And we wouldn't, you know, from the background check piece, we wouldn't, it would have to be equal to or more stringent than what we currently
Okay.
do. So it wouldn't be less, you know, stringent than we currently do.
Okay. Any other questions? Yeah, Roxanne?
But I just think it's exciting that we're reviewing this, not just for the sake of Uber, but I'll just suggest that when you're downtown and you stay downtown late, it is not easy to catch a cab. And I'm not blaming the service that we have here, but we need to reduce the drunk driving. We need to move the populations out of downtown and get them home. The other thing I like about this is services like Uber will help with senior citizens because it's a guaranteed ride. You don't have to hail a cab. That doesn't need to be stressful. And this will also help with people with disabilities. And I just think it'll help for the business component of our community. We talk so much about wanting to create jobs. I think this is an opportunity to do that. Thank you.
So what specific direction do we need if, I'm hearing from this committee, it sounds like pretty much unanimous wanting to move forward on this.
So I think we're looking for
So
direction.
what
Sorry.
direction do you need?
Looking for direction to prepare a draft ordinance and bring that back at a later date.
Okay. Yes.
Would it be possible for us to look at what Spokane just recently passed?
Yes.
Because I think that answers a lot of these questions and maybe could help us from the municipal level.
Yeah, there's actually the city of Vancouver as well. So we can certainly get that information and look at what Vancouver did as well as Spokane. That's not a problem.
Michael?
Well, I'll then just move that we request the administration to develop a draft ordinance based on the outline of this memo. As I said, I think it's a pretty simple, minimalist approach to what we're extending what we're already doing, and I'd like to see that in draft form.
Great. We've got a motion before us. Any other comments? All those in favor of recommending this to the full council, answer aye.
Aye.
Hi.
All right.
Thank you.
That was a good start for the day. Okay, the next is a resolution in support of the City of Bellingham's application to obtain financing through the Washington State Treasurer's Local Option Capital Asset Lending Program to pay for the retrofitting of approximately 3,600 city street lights with LED fixtures.
Gary, I think you skipped one.
What? Oh, I'm sorry. I did.
Otherwise, Chief Newell's
Well, I'm
could.
glad somebody's,
I thought
Yeah.
Chief Newell's was going to talk
I'm
about
still
it.
off on the weekend, yeah. So it was such a nice one. Okay. Let's go back. Yes, the next item is consideration of an interlocal agreement between the City of Bellingham and the Whatcom County regarding division of Whatcom Medic One assets and liabilities.
Yeah, Peter Raffato, City Attorney's Office. So we have before you an interlocal agreement, and this is really a follow-up to the county's notice of termination of the previous interlocal and then the introduction of an alternative contract structure, which we have been operating under now for over a year. With that different structure and with the language in the agreement that was terminated, there was some language in there that talked about if there is no longer a contract in existence. Now, we do have a contract in existence, but it's of a different nature, that there would be a division of assets and liabilities between the City of Bellingham and Whatcom County, because each party had a 50% interest in all of those Whatcom Medic One assets. And the memo on page 159 kind of goes through that. And over the course of the past several months, starting pretty quickly after we were under the alternative contract structure, we were negotiating with the county as to how best to divide up physical assets, property, rolling stock, ambulances, equipment, and real property as well as accounts receivable. And that negotiation resulted in the interlocal agreement that's before you. And at this point, or this evening, we will be asking for the council to look at that and authorize the mayor to execute that interlocal agreement. The interlocal agreement, in summary form as to what it does, is on page 160, and the city will keep cash and investments valued at $864,000 and some dollars, but there will be an equalizing payment to the county, because when you go through the cash and investments and the property, there is an equalizing payment to be made. The city will keep real and personal property valued at $555,000. The city is responsible for accounts payable, which I think at this point have probably already been taken care of. The county will receive accounts receivable balances valued at $353,000, and the county will receive real and personal property valued at $114,652,000. And finally, the equalizing payment would be $363,425,000. Prior to execution of the interlocal agreement, the council will have to approve that. And then there is a procedural step here, which we're here in committee today. This evening, there will be a public hearing on a surplus property declaration. That's a procedural step under state law that before we transfer to another governmental entity real property or property valued at a certain amount, we have to have that public hearing and a declaration by the council. So in committee, we're asking for a vote to approve that, but it's subject to the public hearing. And then this evening, we would be asking for that resolution to be made before we actually vote on the interlocal agreement. So I don't know if there are any questions or any clarifications, Bill, that you would like to make.
Michael?
Thanks, Terry. So as I read the memo, we're dividing up the assets, and the city will be netting around $900,000. More than half of that is equipment, real property, vehicles, and whatnot. But in addition, there's somewhere around $450 in cash and cash equivalents that will be part of the settlement to the city. In terms of our budget, where will this money go? What will be used for? What is it already going to be used for? We're in the middle of operating the EMS system. Where will this cash end up being used?
Bill Newbold, Fire Department. This currently is within the Medic One budget that we operate under, and so the amount will be paid out from that, and the balance continuing in that Medic One.
Is this in any sense an unbudgeted windfall that we'll use next year, or is it already sort of committed and understood and was built into the budget?
No, not an uncommitted windfall, and have Brian Henshaw here give some further budget information.
Brian Henshaw, Finance Department. As soon as I hear windfall. So a couple things. First, you need to remember that this is retroactive. This is back to December 31st, 2013. So the numbers that we are divvying up are based on the financial statements in December of 2013. So when we say cash and investments, that's what was there at the end of that. Subsequent to then, we've been operating the Medic One Fund, and it actually runs on a contract basis with the county, but we are also supplementing that with general fund dollars. It does not pay for itself currently. So the money is sitting there in the Medic One fund, and it's paying it out based on that time frame, but the AP, the AR, that's all continued on for the past year and a half while we've been discussing this, and so that cash was just a moment in time. It's not necessarily still sitting there. So the money will come from that fund and or the general fund when we actually cut the check
Okay,
in a couple weeks.
I was afraid that was the case.
So any other questions here? Okay, I've got a quick question just on procedure on this. So right now you're asking the committee to vote to approve, to recommend approval of the interlocal? Is that?
I think I can answer that. I mean, yes, but it would be subject to the public hearing. It's odd that it's kind of where our meetings are set up. We can't, the public hearing isn't until this evening, and the public hearing leads to that procedural step of having a resolution declaring the property surplus. And ultimately, any recommendation in committee would just be on the interlocal and subject to the public hearing. Once you get to the public hearing, then you'll have a decision to make whether to pass the resolution, and it will only be if you have an affirmative vote on the resolution that we would ask that you in this evening approve the interlocal. So it's really subject to you. It's subject to your desire as to whether you want to have a recommendation on the interlocal right now.
So then, if the committee makes that, we decide to recommend approval, we wouldn't make that recommendation to the full council or anything until after the public hearing and after we took in the information from the public, and so that would be then subject to us changing our mind if something comes up through the hearing.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. Roxanne?
Well, I move that we recommend the interlocal agreement subject to the public hearing.
Yeah. Any comments? Okay, we got a motion before us. All those in favor of the motion answer aye.
Aye.
Aye. Okay, we will, subject to the public hearing, we'll bring this forward tonight. Yeah, thank you. Okay, now I think I can go back to the one I started on. I'm just so excited about these LEDs, I just couldn't wait to get to them. Yeah, resolution in support of the City of Bellingham's application to obtain financing through the Washington State Treasurer's Local Option Capital Asset Lending Program to pay for the retrofitting of approximately 3,600 city street lights with LED fixtures.
All right, thank you. Brian Henshaw, Finance Department again. These next two items are both related to the Public Works presentation that you had at the last meeting, and it is to retrofit the city-owned streetlights. As Terry said, there's about 3,600 of them. The total cost is approximately $4 million, and Public Works has been successful in receiving a Commerce grant for $500,000 and a Puget Sound energy rebate of approximately $400,000. The preferred way we are going to fund this is through the Washington State Local Option Capital Asset Lending Program, which is how we purchased the 6 ambulances that we did last year. So what the state does is they package all of the requests from all the other municipalities, and twice a year they go out and issue bonds for those projects. So the next round of funding is in August. We would be asking for $3.5 million over 12 years. That's the estimated life cycle of the LEDs on the county's schedule. The installation of the LEDs, we hopefully will actually get a longer lifespan than that, but that's what they'll base the financing on. So at the current rate of about 2.3% over 12 years, it'll be about $350,000 that would be paid from in the street fund. So almost $200,000 of it will be guaranteed energy savings, and then about $40,000 of operational savings. The rest will be supplanted or supplemented out of the street fund, and the longer the life of the lights works, the better our payback is. So there will be some years early on that we'll actually be having to pay some of that money out of the street fund. So the first item in your agenda that Terry read already, 20816, is a resolution in support authorizing us to proceed with application to the state local program. And are there any questions on that one item? We need to vote on these individually.
Any questions? Okay. Do I hear a motion?
I'll make one.
Yeah.
I move that we proceed with the application to the state local program for the LED streetlights.
Okay. Any comments? All those in favor of this motion, answer aye.
Aye.
Okay. And then,
Okay, and the second one is the actual ordinance. And the ordinance also has the notice of intent. I submitted the notice of intent back in February in anticipation of this project. There's a lot of financial information, both the audited financial statements and the internal financial statements for the city. And then the second annex item is the finance agreement. If we proceed and the state approves our application, the financing agreement, which is on page, let's see if I can find it here. .209 in your packet. It's a local agency financing contract, series 2014A. This will be the financial document that you're authorizing us to enter into and sign as we proceed. And then the third attachment is C, which is a certificate designating authorized agency representatives, which will be Mayor Kelly, Ted Carlson, and myself. All of the documentations would take two of those three signers to enter into a contract, and we would be issuing that as approval to move into any other documents that are required as the state, because we're kind of doing this at the same time the state is approving our application. So all this is leading up to a financing in August, and this would carry that through that point.
okay. Any questions from committee? Do I hear a motion?
I will move that we recommend passage of this ordinance with regard to the LED program and the state local lending program.
Okay. Seeing no comments, all those in favor of recommending this to the full council, answer aye.
Aye.
Yes.
I just have one more question before you go about the lighting itself. I did some poking around about the lights. I was concerned about the temperature of the lights, the brightness, the blueness of it. Some communities have had complaints about the quality of the lighting. Now, we're not deciding on the actual purchase or the specifics of the light heads at this point, but I'm just wondering if, when you were here before, Ted, Public Works talked about the advantage of the brighter, bluer light, but I think there's some kind of like user issues where the brighter, bluer light isn't always aesthetic. I'm imagining places like downtown where kind of like mood of the nightlife might be negatively affected. Have you looked into that more about other communities' experiences? Because there are complaints sometimes with the lights.
Yeah, well, Ted Carlson, Public Works Department, staff had been looking into that since we started this process, and you're right, historically there's been some jurisdictions that have installed LED lights and received some comments from customers about it's definitely a different light and can be, depending on the grade of light, it can have a bluer look. There's many different grades, different amounts of warmth you can get from the light. We've talked to many jurisdictions about what is preferred by the customers, and we're continuing to do that. Blaine recently went in and did all of their lights, and they received 2 complaints, but they were able to address both of the complaints, and it really had more to do with the amount of light rather than whether it was warm or not, whether it had more of a bluish tint to it. So we have a couple options, both in terms of the actual fixtures that we install But also, we're installing controls with our lighting system. It's a little bit different. It's a lot of jurisdictions haven't done this in the past, but we'll have the ability to dim the lights. Really, we pursued that from an energy savings perspective so that we can really maximize the energy savings by dimming the lights at times of night where we can do that and still provide adequate light for safety and other purposes. But it also allows us to control a little bit of that bright feeling that people might have that's different than the current lights. So we think we have solutions to that, and we've sent our traffic communication superintendent prior to this. He went to several national conferences and lighting conferences really to try to find best practices, and the industry is certainly evolving and providing more guidance for LED lights. And so we feel good about it. We think we're going to have the tools to address the community concerns. We do encourage folks to look at the LED lights that have been installed already over on the Kansas Meter project, as well as 25th up by Bill McDonald Parkway. And we've received positive feedback from those, mostly just because it provides so much more light, and people have been responsive in a positive way to that. But we think we have the tools to respond to the concerns that you've raised and what people have dealt with in the past.
I think there are different locations and different requirements. For example, Bill McDonald Parkway, an arterial, trees on both sides. There are some apartments across the street, but again, these are more focused beams. You can avoid the light spillage and the light pollution. I'm thinking you showed a picture downtown, and I'm if we do some of the downtown lighting, it might have quite a different look. So I guess location sensitivity. We don't need to order 3,600 of the exact same kinds of heads. It sounds like you've looked at this issue. I'm pleased with that, and I hope you'll keep considering where they are in terms of the experience.
Sure.
Roxanne?
Can we also dim the lights on Halloween?
Turn them
Good,
orange.
yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
All right. Jack?
Ted, with the price on this entire project, is this a known price, or that has already been somewhat bid out, or is it something that's going to be bid out? We might be able to get a price reduction through just the bidding process.
No, it is a known price. We're going through the state's pre-approved process through the general administration, and so they have a process where they pre-approve these energy savings companies, ESCOs, and then you work with them. They do bid out the sub work, so there might be some nuances there, but they also have provided us with numbers already. They've pre-bid all of this work. And so this is what we believe the cost will be. I don't know if Eric's still back there. He might be able to add some more detail to that.
Eric Johnston, Public Works. We did go through a formal RFP process to select the preferred ESCO provider. That was done last summer, I believe, and so the provider that was picked for this process was through a formal RFP process.
Okay. And then one other question had to do with following up on Michael's comments about the brightness of the lights. Do we have a budget for providing additional shielding on some of these light heads? Because I know that we do this when we get complaints or requests for shielding, especially in residential neighborhoods.
Right.
Is that something that we're anticipating?
Yeah, I think that's been part of the process, understanding that, for example, in one of the jurisdictions that I spoke to that received just a few complaints, they were, as an example, from corner residential lots where they might have lights on both sides of their property, so it created too much light for them, and those were easily rectified through shielding and directional improvements to the lighting. So we anticipate that'll be part of the process. We still have our folks, our lighting crews that have historically gone out and replaced the heads, installed poles, done all that work, and they'll be certainly able to go through and make any modifications needed if we need to after the work's already been approved through the ESCO. So I think that's kind of been built into our thought process.
Yeah, I would think that the quality of light issue, I mean, if you look at historically what our lights look like in the 60s and 70s and before we went into these John Boehner type lights, it was, I think that, you know, when we went into that orange lighting, that really changed the whole look of many communities throughout the country, and coming back to more of a whitish or a blue light is, I think, a better thing for everybody.
Okay. So we've already voted on this, right? So, okay. Anything else before? Well, thank you.
Thank you.
So we got one more item before us, one little item. It's the presentation of the Fairhaven Parking Task Force final draft report and recommendations.
Yes, thank you.
Long time coming.
That's right, a long time in the making, and as council will recall, when the council adopted the Fairhaven Urban Village and Neighborhood Plan, the parking component of that, the parking study, the council and the Transportation Commission felt that more work was needed to build upon that plan, provide some additional information, work a little bit on the strategies on how some of the management strategies that were identified in the Fairhaven plan would actually be implemented. And so at council's direction, a Fairhaven Parking Task Force was formed that was made up of representatives from the neighborhood, from the business owners, from the property owners, representatives from the Transportation Commission, and staff was also involved in that. And so it's been a long process, and a lot of work has gone into it. And today, we're going to go over the recommendations that came out of that draft report, and here to do that are representatives from the task force. So Barbara Zylstra from the neighborhood group and Tim Crandall, who's part of the Transportation Commission, are going to go through this presentation. Staff is also here to answer any questions. And ultimately, what we're looking for when council is satisfied with the plan would be an approval. We don't have it in the resolution form. We talked a little bit about what that would look like, and at this point, what we're anticipating is just approval from council that would be in the record that this would be the plan that would be used to manage parking in Fairhaven. But if council felt like you wanted something more than that, a resolution, we can certainly come back with one to that effect. So with that, I'll turn it over to Barbara and Tim, and we'll watch the presentation.
Well, hello. I'm pleased to be here to present this to you. It represents a lot of, I won't say any blood, but a lot of sweat over the past few years. And I'm sure you know enough about the public's response to parking to know that this was not a particularly easy task. However, the task force was comprised of very committed people from different segments, and part of the reason it took took longer than anticipated to bring this forward was really coming to some form of consensus and getting the different stakeholders behind this proposal, which included, well, we'll get to it, includes some paid parking. Ted already reviewed the background, how we came to be. The history of Fairhaven parking. Parking's always an issue. As you can see, it's been an issue. It's been studied, it's been debated, and there have been several solutions for parking in Fairhaven. So the Parking Task Force, Ted already went over the different groups that were represented. I did want to take a moment to thank the city staff. We were very fortunate to have such talented people help us. Toril was our secretary and did all of the organizational work for structuring our meetings, getting the meetings set up, recording our comments and discussions, and in large part responsible for putting this document together for you. Jackie Lynch from planning was a great asset in her experience of the history of Fairhaven and also about city requirements for parking when that became an issue. And a special thanks to Eric, who provided us with a lot of needed information from the downtown plan, from other communities, what they've done. Also, his expertise in parking and parking strategies, funding or financing, different kinds of technologies for loops instead of meters was really important to our success. But also importantly, none of them pushed for a particular agenda. They provided us with information, and I really appreciated that. That this really is the work of the committee or the task force. Okay, the key issues, pretty familiar, I'm sure, with those if you have been in Fairhaven. The perception of a lack of parking had a lot to do, we talked a lot about that with the Transpost study that the city had done in 2011, I believe. Anyway, it's referred to as the study in our draft report. It wasn't actually 100% accurate, but in the end, we overlooked some of the discrepancies and recognized that it represented basically the current conditions. But people perceive that there's a lack of parking. And a part of that perception is because certain parts of Fairhaven are densely parked and the peripheries are not. And so that contributes to that. We divided Fairhaven up into zones as part of the strategies. And these zones, number 1 is the rural core, Fairhaven commercial core. 2 is commercial, but it's a little bit more of the periphery. 3 is the port property, and 4 is residential and neighborhoods. Part of 4 is, where the number 4 is part of Fairhaven, but the others are South Hill and South and Happy Valley. Go back. Importantly, we decided that we wanted annual counts for the first 5 years just to get a baseline for how things are moving and how the plan is working. Our standard was to have 85% occupancy with a 2-hour turnover, which correlates to about 1 to 2 parking spaces available per block. And a very important change that begins, assuming that the council approves this, stage 0 is now and things that would go forward in. We've recommended there be an enforced 2-hour time limit on the hatch-marked streets, which is the core of the core. It's where you have difficulty finding a parking place almost any time. So we'd enforce 2-hour parking to eliminate, primarily to eliminate employee parking. That continues to be somewhat of a problem. And if it can free up 1 to 2 places per block, that's our goal. As soon as we approved this document in February, I'm sure you, following the Herald, saw the headlines of paid parking is coming to Fairhaven, which of course generated a lot of public comment, which is included in the draft report. It is a part of this, it's one of the parking strategies that is available to use in stage 2 when all the other management strategies have exhausted the supply and it's not working. Another important goal is the zone 4, all of the residential areas. It was really our intent that the commercial parking not be pushed out into the neighborhoods. And so we have some specific suggestions on how to minimize that. One of the big pieces in the our key outcomes had to do with financing. There are a number of possibilities included in the document, but the recognition, the final one here, of the benefits of cooperative agreements between property owners and the city is an important one because that's worked in the past, and I think that there's a great possibility for that to continue. Oh, there was one other point that I failed to make when we looked at this because I was focusing on the 2-hour time limits. The orange, or the kind of reddish-orange properties that are listed there are currently being used for parking. They're private property available for surface parking, but the great potential and will be developed at some point. So one of the loss of any of those properties would trigger moving to the next stage. That's one of the triggers. Okay. And now I'll turn it over to Tim.
Tim Crandall, Transportation Commission. Thank you, Barbara. So the Transportation Commission reviewed the report on March 10th, and we basically don't have a lot to say. We endorsed the report, and we like the framework that the task force put together with the zones and the stages. So this allows independent action to take place in the various zones based on what's happening in the neighborhood, properties being sold or studies showing that parking has been consumed. So I think that approach will work well, and if the council goes forward and approves the draft report, the stage 0 recommendations are things we would like to see put into action immediately. So Barbara mentioned the 2-hour parking limits. There's some other things there. I think they fit within the city's budget and operation plans, so they're things that can be implemented immediately. One of the things you'll see from the public comments is a lot of people wanted a parking structure, and also about a similar number wanted no paid parking in Fairhaven. So those two things are at odds with each other, obviously. And one of the big things I think that will need to be addressed early is how a source of funding would be developed, and how would we put in some sort of a parking facility that's going to cost, require some capital investment. I really don't have anything else to add. I think the TC really commends the task force for their good work, and we did have three Transportation Commission members on the task force, so we were in tune with the month-to-month operations of the group. So it worked out very well.
Okay. Roxanne.
Well, I just really, really want to thank the committee for all of this work, because I know it is not easy when you're dealing with a specific geographic area that's in high demand. Everybody wants to be there. And so I really thank you for this work. And I'd just like to say that what you've come up with fits my dream for how we're going to improve Fairhaven over time, especially in relation to parking, with the short-term improvements, long-term infrastructure building, and then my dream that we can improve transportation linkages into and out of the district. So thank you.
Yeah, I really like what's come out of this, and I know it's been a lot of work getting to this. But I do think it comes, I like most of everything in here, but the one big unanswered question comes down to how do we fund parking improvements and other things in Fairhaven. On page 39 of the report, the second paragraph, and it does mention that the initial capital investment would need to come from the cities currently written, and certainly not without controversy, stressing not without controversy. The Bellingham Municipal Code does allow for city parking revenues to help pay for this type of expense. And this is an interesting one because past councils have been very clear in terms of almost all of the parking revenues are parking revenues generated in the downtown. And the councils have been very clear that money generated in that parking goes towards that area. And somehow it never gets put in officially, so these kind of things keep coming back out, squeaking out about not without controversy as currently written, never quite gets put in the way council has addressed it in the past. And so I think this is a question that has to be answered in terms of putting in, if we're going to put in infrastructure, whether it gets to paid parking, Luke, or any of those systems. When we did the parking structure downtown, it was through bonds paid for by revenue. Is it possible to fund parking infrastructure, whether it's meters, Luke systems, those kind of things, through bonds to be paid for by revenue generated within the district? So it keeps that separate, because we know if we go to the parking fund to fund the infrastructure in Fairhaven, you're going to get a firestorm from downtown, because it's just, they've been trying to build up their revenues to do another parking structure, which never seems to happen because the money keeps going otherwhere. And so
Yeah,
that's my question.
Sure. Yeah, no, definitely understand that. So in the near term, I think there's a couple things to help answer that question. In the stage 0, the first actions that were identified are really signing in terms of cost of implementation. They're the signage, markings, and we anticipate that would come out of the transportation budget, so the Public Works Street Fund money, so not parking. In the early aspects of the plan, the parking-related costs would be parking enforcement. And one of the keys to this, and this kind of happened as the task force was working through this process, was council raising the citations for outside the downtown area to truly cover the cost of parking enforcement. So that's really the cost to parking in the early stages, and we believe that it's cost neutral and that the revenue collected through citations would offset that. Longer term, we certainly understand when you get to the point of the plan where there's infrastructure costs, whether it's putting meters in or some pay station, and then certainly way down the road if you're talking about a structure, that there's a lot of discussion around the financing of that would have to occur prior to that through the budgeting process, through council's discussions about parking. The real constant to this was that the task force and staff recognized that before that type of money is spent in Fairhaven, it has to be tied to paid parking in Fairhaven. So, Terry, to your point, can the revenue generated within the Fairhaven district cover the cost? That would be ideal. That would certainly be the starting point, that if you're going to put in pay stations, that the revenue from that helps pay the capital or pays the capital cost of that. I think what we found when you look at structured parking, and this again, as Barbara talked about, is in the out stages, so there's certainly time to talk about this. We recognize that the cost of structured parking is going to require a pretty comprehensive financing package that's going to include money from the city through some type of probably debt issuance, but also private contributions. They talk about fee and lieu programs in this. They talk about other ways to get developer costs to help pay for the structured parking. But we, throughout this whole process, were very much aware of the discussion and the direction from council that parking revenue collected in the downtown parking management zone through fees, parking fees for permit lot, off right-of-way lots, and on-street revenue, the intent is to keep that in the downtown. And you've been very clear, we understand that. So what we thought was, this is a nice phased strategy, early costs borne by the street fund, enforcement costs by the parking fund, but offset by citations, and a lot of discussion down the road about how do we fund infrastructure, really with that in mind, council's previous direction.
So if we approve this, can we put a stipulation, recommendation, since you do have in this report that it can come from that
and I think that's certainly part of the deliberation with council, is that and that's what this is really for, is to bring this document to council for ultimately your approval, but certainly any modifications that council would like to make to it. So if you wanted clarity on that part, it's council, obviously.
Because I would definitely want clarity, and this is not at anything at Fairhaven, because if it goes to Fairhaven and it's paid parking, Fairhaven revenue pots could look at the same thing from others, you know, oh, maybe we can go to that to pay for this other area. And I know the merchants and others there will make the same comments that the ones here do, that we shouldn't be financing different parking projects for other areas out of the revenue generated here. Michael.
Thanks, Terry. I think I would be in favor of a resolution to accept this report, in part because in that resolution we could put in some of the council direction you're referring to, our understanding and those additional policy parameters.
Yes.
You can't modify their report. That's their report.
So
I think
know
I'd
that.
prefer to do it as a resolution. It doesn't have to be very long at all. I also want to say that I remember, I think it was at my motion that we put in a 2-year time limit on this. It took just over 2 years, but frankly, I'm really pleased and I'm glad we took the time necessary. That's a pretty quick turnaround for a meaty topic, and there was enough time taken on this. But I'm very pleased with the result, but I really haven't a chance to digest this completely. So, you know, I think it'd be nice to talk about what we might include in the resolution and not approve this tonight.
Right.
I have every intention of accepting this report, but I want to talk about that more. And you raised an important issue, Terry. We have been pretty clear that downtown parking revenue was originally promised to benefit the downtown and should stay that way. So how then do you pay for more significant expenses? One of the things that I've talked about with regard to downtown and more generally is how public and private developments can cooperate. Rather than building a whole new public parking garage, for example, is there ways, and with various projects, it's been talked about downtown, that there could be a public contribution, an equity stake in a private building that overbuilt parking. And the idea here is you can share the same pad, the same limited resource of land, and potentially put in, you know, publicly available parking along with private development. That is mentioned about structured parking within mixed-use projects. When that was written that way, structured parking within a mixed-use project, was that referring to kind of a public-private partnership where instead of having to buy all new land and put in parking structure, there would be significant public or some other kind of contributions to the project, and that's how it would come about?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, that same guidance is in the downtown plan as well. I mean, I think it goes back to the recognition that it is very difficult for a jurisdiction to finance a structured parking garage. And you know, whether it's Seattle or Tacoma, they're finding the same thing. Spokane is that you really do need to have a partnership and take advantage of and be opportunistic of other development that's occurring. So I think that's certainly the intent. And I don't know if Barbara or Tim want to elaborate on it, but that's very consistent with the council's direction with the downtown plan as well.
We did discuss that in part. We did discuss that in part because Fairhaven is such a small district. If you look at the number of square blocks, it's very small. To support a structure would be an incredible burden. So we talked a lot about the possibility of it being a public-private partnership.
And you often use the word parking structure, but maybe it's better to say parking facility because it doesn't necessarily have to be a multi-level. And certainly with the staged approach that has been recommended, we could start with something, you know, maybe port properties available or something, right? Maybe there's some way to get a gravel lot implemented before we go and, you know, make other investments or while we're looking for funding. So I think there's a lot of options in the plan.
Michael?
Thanks for letting me continue. So one of the ideas in here I thought was really promising is the idea of a parking business and improvement area for Fairhaven. It has many advantages, and one of the primary advantages is it's basically landowners in the area, you define a boundary, it's a petition and approval process from those landowners to the city, but once this entity is created, it's a self-assessment, and the monies that go to the PBIA pass through the city but are not controlled by the city. This addresses the concerns. There's no way legally the city could divert those revenues, and the PBIA operates under certain rules. It's governed by the property owners, and they would be able to spend it or not spend it on building a parking or adding to parking facilities or other general Fairhaven supporting activities. So I think there's a lot of promise in the PBIA. I know it's been talked about in downtown. Frankly, I'm a huge supporter of the idea of doing it in our downtown as well. Mm-hmm. How far along did those discussions get? And do we not talk about that in earnest till we hit stage 1? Because we're in stage 0 now. When do we talk in earnest about that? Because I see a PBIA as having numerous benefits, even if it isn't just for parking. But that, I think, would be one of the, it would be a dedicated source of revenue that doesn't depend upon meters.
We did discuss it. The financing part, with the help from staff, was just all the different possibilities that there could be, and that was one of them. I think that's the next step. On our way up last week, I was talking to Tim. I said, the thing is that we just never got to really moving forward with the financing. But if you look at the task force, we were to set forth a plan and strategies, and now the financing is how are we going to implement that. As Ted said, the early strategies really are of minimal cost, can be implemented through the city. But it is a big discussion, and I think we need to continue. That's the next step for our task force doesn't exist anymore since we completed our task, but it's possible to get possibly the same people together and continue on.
Okay, good. Roxanne, yeah.
Well, I'd like to move that we ask the council to review the Fairhaven Parking Task Force recommendations to prepare for a discussion of a resolution at a future council meeting.
So with that, will we be asking, as part of that motion with the council, then to ask staff to prepare a resolution to come back? Okay.
Yeah, if it works for council, we can, maybe council could take some time to review it and send questions to staff. Then we can work together to schedule a future work session where we come back, go over those questions, and then out of that would come the, the resolution.
Okay. We've got a motion before us. Any comments? Michael?
I'm happy to support this. I remember, 6-8 years ago, when there was an attempt to do some urban village planning for Fairhaven, and people said, oh, it can't be done. People can't come together. Well, we came together, but we left out supposedly the hardest part, parking, right? We avoided the hardest nut. Oh, no, we'll never come together. I had confidence then, maybe it was a little bit too optimistic, that we could actually come together, have something realistic for Fairhaven. And luckily I was right. We did come together. We're not going to paid parking yet, but I think it's an important and very significant step that we're looking, if we adopt these recommendations, at going to 2-hour limited parking in Fairhaven core and the core only. I think that is the next logical step. It is one step towards truly managing the parking in Fairhaven actively. Right now, it's management by neglect. We're hoping people behave well. We're hoping employees don't park where they're not supposed to. We're hoping that the crowded times people realize there's available parking over there at McKenzie if you just you go over there. That is a significant step forward toward parking management in Fairhaven. It's an active, responsible step. If we adopt this, that's where we're going. And I'm glad it's one step short of metered parking, although in truth, I think metered parking will come one day, and when it does come, I hope it's in the form of high technology where we can vary the amount, vary the location, and tie that to a notification system so people do know where parking is. It's the same dream I have for downtown, where if you don't know there's parking in this block, but it's around the corner and you can't see around the corner, it might as well be on Mars. So when that comes one day, I look forward to that kind of system.
Okay, anything else? Well, thank you for your presentation. What? Oh, I'm sorry. I thought we voted. Okay. All those in favor of the motion, answer aye. Aye. Okay, we'll recommend that to the council tonight. Thank you for all your work. And I think that's the last committee, so this committee is adjourned.